Rain hammered the cracked asphalt of Providence's old waterfront the night Ryder Hollister learned that the woman society had thrown away might be worth more than every dollar his empire had ever laundered. He was 37, the most feared man on these docks, the kind of figure whose name made dock foremen lower their eyes and rival crews change their routes. And that night he was bleeding out in the front seat of a wrecked sedan with 2 bullets in his side, and no one in the world who'd grieve if he didn't make it. He'd built everything from blood and grudges, the casinos, the cargo routes, the quiet fortune buried under shell companies, and he'd done it all, carrying a single rotten certainty in his chest, that his mother had walked out on him when he was 12 and left him to rot in a state home. He hated her the way other men loved God, completely and without question. So when a heavy-set young woman in a soaked thrift store coat dragged his half-dead body out of the rain and into a rusted van that smelled of cold soup and motor oil, he didn't see a savior. He saw June Calloway, 27, homeless, the kind of person the well-dressed crowd at his casinos would have stepped around without a second glance, too poor, too plain, too forgettable to matter. She'd been a nursing student once, before her mother's illness swallowed every dollar and every door she'd ever had, before the medical debt and the eviction notice left her sleeping in a van by the water. But her hands still remembered how to stop bleeding, and her heart had never learned how to walk past a dying man. She stitched him up, kept him warm, and asked for nothing, and that nothing unsettled him more than any threat ever had. When he finally stood, healed and suspicious, and unable to understand why a stranger would save a monster, he did what powerful men do when they can't process a debt. He tried to pay it off and make it disappear. "What do you want?" he demanded, expecting a number. She only said she wanted a home somewhere no one could throw her out of again. And so, with a cruel little smile, he pulled out the keys to the one piece of property he despised above all others. His dead mother's house. The house he'd never set foot in, the house he planned to sell and forget. He tossed the keys into her trembling hands like a man discarding garbage, and told her to take the home of the woman who'd ruined him. June caught them with a look of pure disbelief, certain it was a trick. It wasn't, but what neither of them knew what had been waiting for 25 years behind a damp, forgotten wall inside that house would unravel everything Ryder Hollister thought he knew about the woman he'd spent his whole life hating, and would bring the hardest man on the Providence docks to his knees, weeping on the floor like the boy he'd buried long ago. If stories about second chances, buried family secrets, and the kind of love that reaches even the coldest heart are what keep you coming back, then do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who believes people are worth more than their worst day, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now then, let's head back to that rain-soaked waterfront and find out what really happened the night a homeless woman saved a monster and what was hiding inside his mother's house. The house stood on the edge of Federal Hill, where old brick-paved streets curved between rows of attached homes that still carried the shape of a prosperity long faded. And when June Calloway slipped the key into the lock for the very first time, her hand was still trembling as though she feared the door would refuse to open, as though all of this were only some cruel joke she didn't deserve to keep. The lock was stiff from too many years without anyone touching it. But at last it turned with a dry, scraping cry, and the heavy wooden door opened onto a still pocket of darkness, breathing into her face the damp smell of mildew mixed with old wood, the dust of time, and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers left forgotten in a vase for many years. She stood on the threshold for a long while, not daring to step inside right away, because after all those months of sleeping curled up in the van by the waterfront, after all those nights being startled awake by the knocking of people who didn't like her, a real roof with 4 walls and a door that could be locked from the inside felt so extravagant it almost didn't seem real. June stepped in, and the weak light from the curtained window slipped through the dust hanging in the air, revealing a living room that time had left behind, where every piece of furniture had been covered beneath white cloths, yellowed with age, standing silent like gentle ghosts asleep. She tugged lightly at one cloth, and beneath it appeared an old velvet armchair, its arms worn thin but still giving off the warmth of a place where someone had once sat reading for hours. And June suddenly realized this house wasn't cold in the way abandoned places are cold, but cold in the way a place is when it had once been loved and then suddenly left behind. On the mantel, a row of picture frames had been laid face down, all of them turned away from the room as though someone, in some moment of pain, had no longer had the strength to look at the faces inside. And June didn't turn them over, not because she lacked curiosity, but because some tender instinct told her there were sorrows that shouldn't be touched too soon by a stranger. She set the thin cloth bag that held everything she owned down on the creaking wooden floor, and then she did the only thing she knew how to do to show gratitude to a place. She began to clean. She found rags and an old bucket in the small kitchen, filled it from a faucet that first ran rusty and then slowly cleared, and she wiped each window pane until the late afternoon light of Providence could enter in warm golden streaks across the floor. Wiped the dust from the tabletop, washed the white cloths clean, and folded them neatly instead of throwing them away, because to June, even the oldest things deserved to be treated with kindness. The more she cleaned, the more she felt the house quietly beginning to breathe again, like a living thing that had held itself silent for too long and was only now being allowed to live, and she caught herself whispering thanks to the unknown woman who had once lived here, the woman she had never met and knew only through the way that cruel man spoke of her, with nothing but bitterness. When June reached the wall at the far end of the hallway, her fingers brushed against a swollen patch of wallpaper, damp and much colder than the rest, as though inside that wall some hidden source of moisture had been silently seeping for many years, and she stopped, pressing her palm gently against it, feeling the plaster underneath the faded floral paper soften in an unnatural way. She decided she would repair it when she had a little money, murmuring to herself that a house this decent didn't deserve to be ruined by one damp stain, and then she turned away and continued her work, never knowing that behind that cold patch of wall, a secret that had waited for 25 years was quietly waiting for the day when a hand gentle enough would find it. On the first night, June spread her thin blanket over the armchair, turned off the light, and for the first time in a very long while, she slept without dreams, held inside the protection of walls whose hidden truth she did not yet know. A few miles to the north, where the poor streets of the harbor district gave way to a quiet hill neighborhood with high iron fences and trees trimmed down to the last fraction of an inch, Ryder Hollister's mansion rose behind automatic gates, luxurious and cold, just like its owner, a place with more rooms than the number of people he had ever allowed to step inside. Ryder sat in the study on the second floor, his shirt unbuttoned to reveal the bandage wrapped around his ribs, a glass of hard liquor set beside him and still untouched, and he stared through the glass door into the Providence night with the expression of a man who couldn't digest something that had just happened to him. For many years, he had grown used to a world that operated by simple rules, where every favor had a price, every kindness hid a calculation, and every person he met wanted something from him. And yet the woman in that rusted van had asked for nothing at all. It was that very lack of asking that lodged inside his mind, like a splinter he couldn't pull free. There was a soft, steady knock at the door, and then Silas Vance stepped in, the man who had stood beside Ryder for more than 10 years, neat in a dark suit, his face so composed that it almost never revealed anything, a thin file held in his hand. Silas placed the file on the desk and reported in a low, even voice that the woman's name was June Calloway, 27 years old, once a nursing student before dropping out halfway through, no criminal record, no connection to any gang, just a homeless woman barely surviving in the harbor district after losing her home because of the medical debt left behind by her dead mother. Nothing more and nothing less. Ryder listened without turning around, his finger tapping lightly against the arm of his chair, and he asked whether there was any chance she had been planted by someone, whether her appearing in the right place at the right time that night could have been arranged, because in his world, coincidence was a luxury only the naive dared to believe in. Silas remained silent for a moment longer than necessary, then answered that according to what they had uncovered, she was completely clean, just someone who happened to be there. But as he said those words, Silas's eyes flicked briefly toward the file, then lifted to Ryder with a look that was very hard to read, something caught between caution and a calculation hidden so carefully that even Ryder, who was used to reading people, couldn't catch it. Ryder said that clean or not, he still wanted his people to keep an eye on her, to watch from a distance, to record whom she met, where she went, and whom she talked to, because a living witness to the night he had nearly died was a loose thread he couldn't leave dangling. Silas nodded and accepted the order, promising to assign men to watch the house in Federal Hill without letting her know. Before Silas withdrew, Ryder asked one more question, his voice trying to sound indifferent but unable to hide the tension beneath it, asking whether Beckett had made any recent moves, and the moment that name was spoken, the air in the room seemed to thicken, because Beckett Hollister, the cousin who had always hungered for his chair, Was the shadow Ryder had never truly stopped watching? Silas replied that Beckett had remained unusually quiet since the ambush, and Ryder let out a faint, cold laugh, saying Beckett's silence was more dangerous than gunfire, then signaled for Silas to leave. When the door closed, Ryder sat alone in the darkness, one hand unconsciously pressing against the wound at his ribs, and strangely, what kept him restless that night wasn't the person who had wanted him dead, but the image of a poor woman who had saved him and then asked for nothing. An image that clung tighter the harder he tried to push it away, as though it had come from a world he had forgotten had ever existed. The first days in the house on Federal Hill passed for June like a dream she was always afraid she would wake from, and to keep her hands from trembling under the weight of that almost impossible good fortune, she filled them with work, sweeping every corner, arranging the old belongings, and each morning walking to the small market at the end of the street to buy a little bread and some cheap vegetables, with the few dollars she earned from washing dishes for a diner near the harbor. It was during those walks that June slowly came to know the neighborhood. The old flower seller who always pressed a wilted stem into her hand without taking any money, the elderly shoe repairman who greeted her with a nod every morning, and she realized that even though the people here were poor, they still kept a kind of warmth alive for one another that those cold, wealthy neighborhoods could never have. One afternoon, as she was passing the small gray stone church tucked between the harbor streets, June stepped inside to escape a sudden rain, and there in the quiet sanctuary she met Father Aldous, an old priest with white silver hair and gentle eyes, deeply marked by the wrinkles of a man who carried too many stories inside him that could not be told. He invited her to sit, poured her a cup of hot tea, and they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the neighborhood, the fact that she hadn't moved here very long ago, until he asked where she was living, and June, with the shy smile of someone still unaccustomed to having an address she could say out loud, answered that she lived in the old house on the edge of Federal Hill, the house that had once belonged to a woman named Margot. The moment that name left her mouth, June saw the teacup in Father Aldous' hand freeze in midair, and his kindly face changed for the briefest instant, his eyes widening before quickly lowering as if to hide some powerful emotion that had just surged up inside him. And for one moment he no longer looked like a calm priest, but like a man who had just heard the name of a beloved ghost. June asked in confusion whether she had said something wrong, whether he had known that woman, and Father Aldous set the teacup down with a hand that trembled slightly, remaining silent for a long while before answering in a voice thick with emotion that yes, he had known Margot, known her very well in fact, and that she had been one of the kindest souls he had ever had the grace to meet in all his years as a priest. June waited for him to say more, a gentle curiosity rising in her heart, but Father Aldous only tightened his hands together and fell quiet, his gaze drifting toward the stained glass window where the afternoon light was slowly fading, and she could clearly feel that there was an entire story pressing against his chest, trying to spill out, but held back by something stronger. A promise, a burden, a secret he had sworn to carry with him. In the end, he only said that Margot had been a mother who loved her child more than her own life, that there were things in this world that were not what they appeared to be, and that if one day June found anything in that house, she should remember that the woman who had lived there was not the person people had whispered about. Those words left June more confused than enlightened, but she didn't ask anything more, because she had lived long enough in suffering to understand that some wounds should only be touched when people choose to open them themselves. When June rose, thanked him, and stepped back outside into the rain that had begun to ease, Father Aldous watched her figure disappear at the end of the street, then turned back inside, knelt before the altar, and for the first time in many years, he prayed not for the dead, but for the woman who had just entered that house, praying that she would be gentle enough and brave enough to bear the truth he had promised he would never be the one to speak. Father Aldous' veiled words followed June all the way back to the house and stayed in her mind for several nights, making it impossible for her to forget the damp wall at the end of the hallway, that cold, swollen patch her fingers had touched on the first day. And on one rainy afternoon, when she couldn't go wash dishes for hire, June decided to begin repairing it. Not exactly because the house needed fixing, but because some urge she couldn't name kept pulling her back toward that wall. She took the dull knife from the kitchen and gently pried at the peeling wallpaper. And when the faded floral paper fell away, what appeared beneath it wasn't the seamless plaster she had imagined, but a squared seam far too even to be natural, as though someone had once cut out a section of the wall and then plastered it back in clumsily and in a hurry. June's heart began to beat faster. She pressed her palm against that patch of plaster and felt that it was hollow inside. And with a trembling made of both fear and instinct, she used the knife handle to tap against it, hearing the empty sound that confirmed what she had just guessed, that behind this wall there was a hidden space. She pried away the soft plaster piece by piece, lime dust scattering down onto the wooden floor, and when the hole was wide enough, June reached into that cold darkness, her fingers touching the icy metal surface of a box, and she pulled it out with both hands. An old tin box covered in dust and streaks of rust, far heavier than it looked, heavy in the way only things that hold an entire human life can be heavy. June sat down on the floor in the dimming house, set the box in her lap, and for a long while she only looked at it, not daring to open it, because she had the feeling that the moment she lifted that lid, something in this house, and perhaps in her own life as well, would change forever. At last, she drew in a deep breath and snapped open the rusted latch. The lid rose with a soft creak, and inside, arranged with heartbreaking care, was a whole treasury of memory. Stacks of yellowed envelopes tied with faded ribbons, a worn brown leather notebook that June guessed was a diary, and on top of everything, several black and white photographs stained by time. June lifted the top photograph with trembling fingers, and from within the frame, a young woman smiled back at her, a gentle face with faintly sorrowful eyes, holding in her arms a little boy of only a few years old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed strangely familiar to June, eyes she felt she had seen somewhere before. Cold and fierce even when he was still a child. She turned through the photographs one by one and saw that boy growing older through the years, and then suddenly the picture stopped when he seemed about 12 years old, as though after that, the woman had never again been given the chance to take another picture. And that abrupt break sent a chill running down June's spine. She set the photographs aside and took up the stack of letters, slipping the top one free from the ribbon, and beneath the yellow glow of the only lamp in the room, she opened the envelope that had grown brittle with age, drew out the carefully folded paper inside, and when she unfolded it, June saw the first line written in the soft, slanting handwriting of a woman, a line that caught the breath in her throat. To Ryder from Mother. June read those 4 words again and again, her heart pounding as the truth began to reveal its first faint edges, because that name Ryder was one she knew too well. It was the name of the ruthless man who had thrown these keys into her hand as though he were throwing away trash, the man who hated his mother down to the bone, and now in her hands was a letter that Mother had written to the very son who had abandoned her, a letter that had never been sent, lying still in the dark for 25 years as it waited for someone to find it. And June, with ice-cold hands and eyes already blurred with tears, knew she had just touched the beginning of something far larger than herself. June hadn't even had time to finish reading the first letter when the low, heavy rumble of an expensive car stopped in front of the house, and through the gap in the curtains, she saw the familiar tall figure of the man who had given her those keys step out, making her heart tighten in panic. In an instant, she hurriedly shoved the tin box and the stack of letters back into the hollow space in the wall, pulled the old cloth over it for the moment, then rushed into the living room, trying to steady herself, just as Ryder Hollister pushed the door open without bothering to knock, because in his mind, this was still his property, and she was nothing more than someone he had granted a place to hide as an act of charity. Ryder stepped in with his usual coldness, both hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat, and told himself that he had only come by to remind her of her place and ensure she wasn't using his name out on the docks. A rigid excuse that sounded so reasonable even he could almost believe it, though deep inside he knew perfectly well that for days now, the image of this woman who asked for nothing had been haunting his mind in such an irritating way that he had been forced to come here himself just to drive it away. But when his eyes swept across the room, something inside him faltered, because the house he had always imagined as a filthy place taken over by a homeless woman was now so clean and warm it felt unfamiliar. The windows clear enough to let the afternoon light drift in, the wooden floor polished from careful wiping, the furniture covers folded neatly into orderly stacks in the corner instead of being tossed around, and the whole house giving off a kind of warmth that he, its lawful owner, had never once felt. Ryder stood motionless in the middle of the room, and confusion showed in his eyes no matter how hard he tried to hide it, because he had prepared himself to despise her, to find an excuse to throw her out. And yet what he saw was proof of a respect he couldn't understand. A person so poor, she had nothing still cherishing the very place he had treated like trash to be gotten rid of. June stood close to the wall, her hands clenched tightly together, trying not to let her gaze slide toward the end of the hallway where the secret had just been hastily hidden, and she softly asked what he needed, her voice trembling but not pleading, only guarded in the way of someone who knew she was standing before a dangerous man. Ryder didn't answer right away. He stepped one pace closer, his cold, sharp eyes studying her face as though searching for some sign of deceit or calculation, and he asked why she bothered cleaning a house that wasn't hers so carefully, why someone who had nothing would waste her effort taking care of something that could be taken away from her at any moment. And June lifted her eyes to meet his directly, answering softly that it was because this was the first place in a very long time that had given her a roof over her head, and a place that treated her kindly deserved to be treated kindly in return, whether it belonged to her or not. That answer struck Ryder silent, a strange feeling cutting through his chest, because that was exactly the kind of thinking the world he lived in would never tolerate, and for one moment he looked at her no longer as a contemptible homeless woman, but as a creature from another world. A world he had lost a very long time ago. The tension between them loosened in silence, not into friendliness, but into something that didn't yet have a name, a fragile thread just beginning to connect two people standing at opposite ends of life, and Ryder suddenly turned toward the door as if fleeing from that very feeling, leaving behind only a curt remark that he would come back, before the door slammed shut behind him. June leaned against the wall and breathed out in relief, her heart still pounding wildly, and she glanced toward the end of the hallway where the mother's letter was still waiting, her mind tangled around a question she didn't yet dare to answer, whether she should tell that ruthless man about what she had just found. That night, after making sure the sound of Ryder's car engine had completely dissolved into the Providence darkness, June returned to the wall at the end of the hallway, took the tin box out from its hiding place, and this time she didn't open the letters, but instead picked up the brown leather journal, sat down beside the yellowing lamp, and turned through each page made brittle by the years, because she had a feeling that in order to understand those letters, she first had to understand the woman who had written them. The first pages of the journal belonged to a young mother overflowing with happiness, writing about her little son named Ryder, about his laughter, about the way he clung to the hem of her skirt every morning, and June read with a smile through her tears, because it was hard to believe that the child so deeply loved in these lines was the same cold man who had left the house only a few hours earlier. But the farther she read, the more the voice in the journal began to change. Joy gave way to fear, and Margot began writing about the Hollister family in trembling lines, about the underworld Ryder's father's family had been sunk in for generations, about the men who carried the Hollister name and treated violence and power as flesh and blood, and about the terror of a mother who realized her little boy was growing up in a swamp that would sooner or later swallow him whole. June turned to the next page, and her hand began to tremble, because there Margot wrote about the day everything collapsed, the day the powerful men in the family gave her a cruel choice, that if she truly loved her son, she had to disappear from his life, had to go far away and never come back, because as long as she stayed beside the boy and tried to pull him away from the family's path, he would be seen as a nuisance that needed to be removed, and they had said plainly that the child's life depended on whether she was willing to leave. Margot wrote that she had fallen to her knees and begged, had pleaded to take her son with her, but they had only laughed coldly and told her that a child with Hollister blood belonged to the Hollister family, that she was only an outsider who had dared to step into a place where she didn't belong, and that if she resisted, then not only she, but her son as well, would pay for it in blood. June had to stop reading there, pressing the letter to her chest as tears rolled down her cheeks, because she was slowly beginning to understand a terrible truth that completely overturned everything she had believed, that this mother had never abandoned her child the way people had whispered, but had been forced to leave him so that the very child she loved could live. Margot wrote that to protect her son, she had agreed to play the part of the worst kind of woman, allowing the family to build the story that she was a selfish woman who had cast aside her 12-year-old child to run after a life of her own, because they told her that only when Ryder believed his mother had abandoned him would he cut himself off from her completely and remain under the family's control without trying to search for her, and that was the price she had to pay to keep her son's beating heart still beating. In the final lines of that journal page, Margot wrote that on the day she walked out the door for the last time, she had heard her son screaming for his mother behind her, and she had to bite her lip until it bled to keep from turning back, because she knew that if she turned back even once, All that sacrifice would become meaningless, and she would rather let her son hate her for the rest of his life than let him die. June closed the journal, covered her face with both hands, and sobbed in the dark house, crying for the mother who had carried the hatred of her own child for 25 years in silence. And inside her rose an aching sorrow, along with a painful question. How could she let that man go on living the rest of his life, believing the lie that his mother had abandoned him, when the truth was this painful and this noble? For several nights after that, June couldn't pull herself away from the tin box, and when she began opening the letters tied neatly with ribbons in their proper order through time, a different picture of the woman named Margot slowly emerged. Not the image of a broken mother who had let go and disappeared, but the image of a mother who had never truly left at all, only loved her son from the darkness for 25 long years. Among the letters, June found dozens of old newspaper clippings, carefully cut out and pressed flat, all of them connected to Ryder, from a tiny notice about a teenage boy winning a prize in a contest at an orphanage, to later articles that mentioned the Hollister name tied to the harbor and shadowy business deals. And in the margins of every clipping, Margot had written a few lines in that familiar slanting hand, sometimes a prayer for her son to be safe, sometimes only 3 simple words, "Mother misses you," written over and over until the ink blurred. June turned through the letters and realized that Margot had silently followed every step of her son's life through all those years. She knew he had been moved from one orphanage to another, knew he had once been gravely ill during a winter when he was 14 years old, knew even the day he left the orphanage to step into the world she had once tried with all her strength to pull him away from, and every milestone in his life had been recorded by her as though she had never been absent for even a single day. In one letter, Margot wrote that she had quietly paid off the entire debt carried by the orphanage where Ryder lived, a large sum she had scraped together over many years by working 2 or 3 jobs at once, and she had asked someone else to send it in their name so no one would know she was the giver, because she feared that if her name appeared, the Hollister family would trace it back and punish even the innocent children who lived with her son. June read with her heart tightening painfully, because she could imagine that woman standing silently across the street from the orphanage on cold afternoons, only to catch sight of her son from far away through the iron fence, not daring to come close, not daring to call his name, not daring to let him see her because she was afraid of breaking the cover she had paid for with her own shattered heart. There was one letter that made June set it down and bury her face in her hands and cry for a very long time. The letter Margot had written on Ryder's 18th birthday, telling how she had stood at a distance and watched her son walk out through the orphanage gates for the last time, had seen that he had grown tall and hardened, but that his eyes were already full of hatred, and she wrote that no matter how deeply he hated her, no matter what kind of man he became, in her heart he would always be the little boy who once clung to the hem of her skirt every morning, and she would rather endure her son's hatred than let him learn the truth and rush into revenge against the family, only to lose his life. June sat in the house, swallowed by darkness, surrounded by letters spread around her like the broken pieces of a mother's heart, and she understood that all this enormous love, all these 25 years, had been hidden behind a damp wall, while the one person who most deserved to know about it was living out there with a heart hardened by hatred. It was in that moment that a resolve began to form inside June, so strong and clear that it swept away every fear she had of that dangerous man, because she knew that no matter how ruthless Ryder Hollister might be, no matter how dangerous speaking this truth might become, he still deserved to know that he had never been abandoned by his mother, that he had been loved his entire life by someone who had sacrificed everything for him, and June decided that somehow she had to be the one to return that truth to him, even though she didn't yet know where to begin. While June sat among the letters and nursed her resolve to return the truth to Ryder, in another building on the far side of the city, inside a sealed room dimmed by cigarette smoke, Beckett Hollister was listening intently to a subordinate's report about the homeless woman to whom his cousin had just given Margot's old house. Beckett was patient and cold in a way different from Ryder, a snake hidden in the grass and waiting for its moment rather than a tiger showing off its strength, and for many years he had quietly fed his ambition to seize the seat at the head of the family, waiting only for Ryder to reveal an opening, so he could strike the decisive blow. When he heard that Ryder had given away the house of his late mother, a piece of property the entire family knew he despised and wanted to wipe clean from his life, Beckett frowned, because a reckless decision like that didn't seem like Ryder at all, and the instinct of a schemer warned him that the house wasn't simply an old pile of brick and plaster. Beckett knew something Ryder didn't. That many years earlier, before Margot had been forced to leave, she had been an intelligent and careful woman, and within the family there had long lingered an old fear that she had kept evidence somewhere of the family's crimes, things powerful enough to sink the entire Hollister empire if they ever came to light. And now that her house had fallen into the hands of an outsider, that fear suddenly came alive in Beckett's mind like a hungry beast. He ordered his men to find out whether the woman named June Calloway had discovered anything in the house, whether she had searched through it or made any repairs, whether she had carried anything unusual out of it, because if that house truly held the evidence the family feared, then it was both a deadly threat that had to be eliminated and the perfect weapon for him to overthrow Ryder once he had it in his hands. But what truly caught Beckett's attention came from another small piece of information, that Ryder had personally returned to that house more than once, and that his cousin, a man famous for being ruthless and distant, seemed to be showing an unusual interest in that homeless girl. And Beckett's lips curved into a sinister smile, because he understood that when a man like Ryder began to soften for another human being, that was the first fatal weakness he had exposed after all these years, a crack Beckett could push his hand into and tear wide open. To make certain, Beckett invited Silas Vance to meet him privately, and during that discreet conversation, he studied Ryder's right-hand man through indirect questions, testing to see whether Silas's loyalty could be shaken, and Silas sat there with his usual composed face, answering with measured words, showing just the right amount of hesitation, revealing only enough of a flicker of uncertainty to make Beckett believe he was slowly drawing a valuable ally out from the heart of the enemy. But no one in that room, not even Beckett, who was so proud of his ability to read people, realized that Silas's appearance of wavering had been calculated down to the smallest detail, a refined performance concealing designs far deeper than anything Beckett dared imagine. When Silas left that smoke-dimmed room, his face still betrayed no emotion, and Beckett remained seated alone, satisfied in the belief that every chess piece was slowly moving into the position he wanted, never knowing that in this game, he too was only a piece in the hands of someone else, and that the life of the homeless girl sitting in the dark house reading letters had now officially been placed on the scales of men who were willing to kill in order to seize power. Just as he had said before leaving, Ryder returned to the house on Federal Hill a few days later, this time late in the evening while a fine rain brushed against the windows, and once again he lied to himself with the excuse of checking on his property, though both of them silently understood that it wasn't the real reason. This time, June didn't panic the way she had before. She only quietly poured him a cup of hot tea and set it down in front of him with steady hands, a gesture so simple it made Ryder go still, because it had been far too long since anyone had treated him like an ordinary human being, instead of a boss who needed to be flattered or a danger that needed to be feared. He sat down in the old armchair, the warm tea steaming between his hardened hands, and in the stillness of the house that had once belonged to the mother he hated, something in Ryder's cold armor began to crack without him even knowing it. June sat across from him, keeping a careful distance, and they spoke in scattered sentences, about the rain, about the house, about harmless little things, until June softly asked him about his childhood, a question she released cautiously, as though touching a wound she already knew was real. Ryder stayed silent for a very long time, his gaze drifting toward some imagined fire in the past, and then, in a low, hoarse voice so different from his usual sharp coldness, he said that when he was 12 years old, his mother had left him behind and disappeared without a word of goodbye, leaving him in an orphanage where he learned that no one in this world stayed for him, that love was only a luxury for naive people who hadn't yet been taught by life, and that from that day on he had built a wall around himself that no one could cross. June listened, with her heart feeling as though it were being crushed, because she was holding the truth that his mother had never abandoned him, that every night she had silently wept for him, that even now the letters proving her love were lying only a few steps from where he sat behind the wall, and his painful confession about the loneliness of being 12 years old made tears rise to her eyes. Before her, she no longer saw a ruthless boss, but a boy left behind who had grown up inside hatred, and her heart filled with such fierce compassion that she could no longer remain silent. June leaned forward, her eyes shimmering, and said softly that there were things about his mother he might never have known, that everything might not be the way he had believed all these years, and that she had found something in this house he needed to see. Ryder's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharpening with caution at her veiled words, and at the exact moment June was about to continue, about to lead him toward the wall at the end of the hallway, The phone in Ryder's coat pocket rang harshly, tearing apart the fragile atmosphere that had just been woven between them. He pulled it out, listened to a few curt words from the other end of the line, and his face instantly returned to the frozen expression of a boss, every trace of weakness that had just begun to show vanishing without a mark. He stood and said there was urgent business he had to handle right away, his eyes sweeping over June one last time with something caught between suspicion and regret, and then he strode to the door and disappeared into the rain. June remained standing in the house, his cup of tea still warm on the table, and she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling both relieved and unbearably heavy, because the truth had risen all the way to her lips only to be swallowed back down, and she couldn't have known that this interrupted moment would be the final quiet pause before the real storm came crashing down upon both their lives. After Ryder left in such haste, June couldn't sleep, and a restless urge pulled her back to the tin box. This time, she turned all the way down to the bottom, a place she had never touched before, and beneath the lining of rotted velvet, her fingers brushed against another stack of papers, entirely different from the letters, papers stiffer, more official, folded neatly, and hidden with great care, as though whoever had placed them there had known this was the most dangerous thing in the entire box. June pulled them out and opened them beneath the lamp, and the more she read, the colder her spine became, because these were not the tender confessions of a mother, but meticulous records of the Hollister family's criminal operations, the names, the dates, the numbers, the evidence of crimes the family had buried for decades, all of it written down by Margot in that familiar slanting handwriting with the caution of a woman who knew she was holding something that could cost her life. Tucked between those pages was one final letter, its handwriting far shakier than all the ones before it, dated just over a year ago. And when June began to read, her heart seemed to stop beating, because in that letter, Margot wrote that after more than 20 years of living in silence to protect her son, she could no longer bear watching Ryder sink deeper and deeper into the very underworld she had sacrificed everything to pull him away from. Margot wrote that she had come to one final decision, that she would break the curse of silence, that she would make public all the evidence she had secretly gathered over the years, not to take revenge on the family, but to set her son free, to prove to the world and to Ryder himself that she had never abandoned him, and to tear her child out of the family's claws once and for all, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. She wrote that she knew how dangerous this was, that the Hollister family would never let her live if they discovered what she intended to do, but she was ready to accept every risk, because to her, life no longer had any meaning if she had to live one more day watching her son become exactly the thing she had once feared. The letter stopped abruptly there, with no closing line, no farewell, as though the writer had been interrupted in the middle and had never again been given the chance to hold a pen, and June sat frozen, as each horrifying piece began to lock into place in her mind. She remembered the rumors people had whispered, that Margot Hollister had died of illness and loneliness more than a year earlier. A quiet death no one cared enough to notice. But now, with this final letter and the stack of evidence in her hands, a very different truth emerged with chilling clarity, that the woman hadn't died of sickness at all, but had been eliminated by the Hollister family at the exact moment she was preparing to reveal the truth to save her son, silenced forever just before she could free the boy she had loved more than her own life. June pressed the stack of papers to her chest, her whole body trembling, both terrified and painfully breathless, because she understood that what she held in her hands was not only a mother's love, but also evidence of a murder, the motive and the sentence for the people who had carried it out, and that the moment this truth came into the light, it would not only heal one heart, but also set fire to a bloody revenge. In the dark house, surrounded by letters and deadly pages spread around her, June realized that everything had now moved far beyond the simple act of giving Ryder the truth about his mother's love, because that mother had been murdered for this very truth, and anyone who held it was carrying a death sentence. And she tightened her grip around the papers, knowing she had just stepped into a dangerous place from which there was no turning back. June hadn't even had time to recover from the horrifying discovery when she heard glass shatter at the back door, sharp and sudden in the dead of night, and her whole body went cold as she realized she was no longer alone in the house. She hurriedly stuffed the papers and the letters back into the tin box, both hands shaking violently, and had only just managed to shut the lid when the shadows of two powerful men burst into the room, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. June backed away, her heart pounding like a frantic drum, her mouth dry, and she bolted toward the front door, but a brutal hand seized her arm and yanked her back. She screamed, struggling wildly, her fingernails scraping against the leather jacket of the man holding her tight. But the strength of one young woman couldn't stand against two men trained to do things like this. A cold voice rang out from behind them, ordering them to find the box, and June understood at once that they had come for what she had just found, that somehow the person behind this had learned about the secret hidden inside the house. She was dragged into the middle of the room, a piece of cloth shoved into her mouth, her wrists tied hard in front of her, and through her tears she saw one man pour a liquid reeking of gasoline along the walls, over the old armchair, and across the very wooden floor she had polished with all her gratitude. June screamed through the gag when she realized what they meant to do. They meant to burn the house to erase the evidence, to reduce every proof to ashes along with her. A match flared in the darkness, and then the fire licked along the trail of gasoline, spreading with terrifying speed, catching the curtains, crawling up the walls, swallowing the room in an instant, until it became a roaring sea of flames. The two men dragged June toward the door, intending to take her with them, but in the chaos of smoke and fire, she fought so violently that she slipped from their grip and fell rolling onto the floor, and instead of crawling toward the door to save herself, her frantic eyes turned toward the end of the hallway where the tin box lay hidden. In that moment, June didn't think of her own life. She thought only of 25 years of a mother's love, of the final letter, of the truth that, if it burned, would leave no one in this world to know how much Margot had sacrificed, and she knew she couldn't let the fire steal that away. Thick smoke rushed into her lungs and made her cough until she choked. The heat struck her face with a burning sting, but June still dragged herself toward the hallway, her hands still bound as she tried to squeeze through the broken opening in the wall, using her own body as a shield. And with one desperate effort, she managed to pull the tin box out of the burning hollow. The flames had surrounded her on every side now, the beams overhead beginning to groan and crack, embers falling like rain, and June clutched the box to her chest with her tied hands, staggering as she searched for a way out through the dense black smoke that made it impossible to tell where the door was. She tripped and fell, her knees striking the scorching wooden floor, her lungs feeling as though they were about to burst from lack of air, and darkness began to close in around the edges of her vision, but she still didn't let go of the box, her arms tightening around it as if it were the only thing keeping her tied to life. Amid the roar of the fire and the collapse of pieces of ceiling, June felt her strength leaving her little by little, her consciousness flickering and drifting away, and in the final moment before darkness swallowed her whole, she had only enough time to think that she had kept the truth safe, that even if she died, Margot's love would still remain intact in her arms, and then her head sank down, her body collapsing in the middle of the sea of fire that was devouring the house that had once given her a home. The urgent call that night turned out to be nothing more than a petty trap meant to pull Ryder away from the house. But while he was on his way back after realizing he had been deceived, he received word from one of the men watching the place that the house on Federal Hill was on fire. And in the moment he heard those words, a feeling he had never known before seized his chest and nearly strangled him, a naked terror that wasn't for himself, but for another human being. Ryder slammed his foot down on the accelerator until the engine roared, the car tearing through the Providence night, and when he turned onto the familiar street, the scene before him made his heart feel as though it had dropped into an abyss. The house that had once belonged to his mother was now swallowed in a red blaze that lit up the whole neighborhood, black smoke rolling into the night sky, and tongues of fire licking outward through every broken window. He braked hard in the middle of the street, threw himself out of the car before it had even fully stopped, and without a second of hesitation, he shouted June's name and rushed straight toward the house, screaming in flames. Despite the terrible heat surging back and forcing him away, a man who had once been used to ordering others to charge into death, a man who had lived his entire life without ever placing his own life in danger for anyone, now kicked open the burning front door himself, lifted an arm to shield his face, and plunged into the sea of fire without calculating the price he would have to pay. Inside was a hell of smoke and heat, visibility almost gone, every breath like swallowing burning coal, and Ryder shouted June's name through the roar of the flames, staggering along the collapsing walls, his eyes stinging and streaming, his lungs burning raw. But he didn't retreat even half a step. He tripped over a fallen beam, went down, struggled back up, and in that desperate moment, he saw her. A small figure collapsed at the end of the hallway among embers falling like rain, her hands still clutching something tightly against her chest even though she was unconscious. Ryder lunged forward, dropped to his knees beside her, and when he saw June's face smeared with black smoke and motionless, something inside him shattered. He called her name in a hoarse voice that sounded almost like begging, a sound he had never heard coming from himself before. He slipped his arms under her and lifted her, feeling her body limp and fragile in his embrace, and he realized that her wrists were tied, her fingernails still locked around the scorched tin box so tightly that even after passing out, she had refused to let it go, as though whatever was inside it mattered more than her own life. A heavy beam from the ceiling broke loose and came crashing down just behind them with a violent crack, flames snapping at the back of Ryder's coat. But he bent low and gathered June completely against him, using his own back and shoulders as a shield to protect her from the embers raining down. And with every last ounce of strength in him, he carried her toward the faint patch of light where the door stood. Each step felt as heavy as lead, smoke tightening around his throat, the whole house groaning as though it were about to collapse over his head. But Ryder only held her tighter to his chest and kept moving, because in that moment, nothing in the world mattered more than getting this woman out alive. When at last he broke through the curtain of fire at the threshold and staggered out onto the grass wet with night mist, he held June tightly in his arms, coughing violently, the back of his coat burned and smoking, and he laid her down on the grass, bending over her and shaking her as he called to her in desperation. For the first time in his life, the most ruthless man on the Providence waterfront begged heaven and earth for another life to keep beating, a life he now realized had become more precious to him than his own. June woke in a stark white hospital room, her throat burning raw and both wrists wrapped in bandages, and the first thing she did when she managed to open her eyes was search for the box in panic, until she saw it sitting on the small table beside the bed, scorched and warped but still intact, and beside the bed sat Ryder, his face drawn with exhaustion, both hands bandaged from burns, his eyes bloodshot from smoke and from an entire sleepless night. He hadn't left her side since bringing her to the hospital, and when he saw her wake, an indescribable flicker of relief crossed his hardened face. But June didn't speak about the fire, didn't speak about the men who had taken her. She only reached her trembling hand toward the box and pushed it gently toward Ryder, then said in a hoarse voice that there were things inside it he needed to read, that she had nearly died to keep them safe for him, and that he deserved to know the truth about the mother he had hated his entire life. Ryder looked at the scorched box for a long while, with suspicion and a vague fear, then picked it up with his bandaged hands. And that night, after June had fallen asleep under the weight of the medicine, he carried the box back to his empty room, set it on the desk beneath the only lamp, and sat facing it, as though facing something he had both feared and longed for all his life. He opened the lid, and when he saw the slanting handwriting on the first letter with the words, "To Ryder from Mother," his hand froze, because it was handwriting he had thought he'd forgotten, only to realize it was still carved deep into the memory of his childhood. Ryder read the first letter, then the second, and then kept reading in absolute silence, and every line cut like a blade into the 25 years of hatred he had built, because inside those letters there was no mother who had abandoned her child, only a mother torn apart, forced to leave in order to keep her son alive, a mother who had fallen to her knees and begged to take her child with her and had been refused. He read about the newspaper clippings she had kept, about the orphanage debt she had quietly paid, about the afternoons when she had stood silently across the street just to look at him from afar, and each detail peeled away another layer of the wall he had built around his heart, revealing beneath it the 12-year-old boy still screaming for his mother, the boy he had thought he had buried long ago. When Ryder reached the final letter, the one written in a trembling hand and dated just over a year before, he read that his mother had decided to break the silence to save him from the underworld, even if it cost her life. And when he came to the final lines where she wrote that no matter how much he hated her, he would always be the little boy who once clung to the hem of her skirt every morning, that the only thing she begged of this world was for him to live, and to live well, something inside Ryder's chest shattered completely. The man who hadn't shed a single tear in more than 20 years, the man feared by the entire Providence waterfront, slowly slipped from the chair and collapsed to his knees on the cold floor, the letter trembling in his bandaged hands. And then he began to cry, a sob breaking loose from the deepest place in a soul that had been frozen for far too long, the cry of a son who had just realized he had spent his whole life hating the one person who had loved him most in the world. He clutched the letters tightly to his chest, bowed his head to the floor, and cried for the mother he hadn't been able to hold one last time, cried for the 25 years stolen by a lie, cried for all the nights she had wept silently for him while he cursed her name. And in that silent room, the most ruthless boss in Providence was finally nothing more than an orphaned son calling for his mother in vain. When his tears finally ran dry, Ryder rose from the floor with an entirely different man inside him, grief forged into a resolve as cold as steel. And the first question tearing through his mind was how the men who attacked June had known exactly about the box in that house, how they had known about something even he himself had not known existed. Because only a handful of people in the world knew that he had given the house to her and had someone watching her. He began tracing every link backward, and the deeper he investigated, the more he uncovered a truth that chilled him to the bone, that every piece of information about June, about the house, about his own schedule on the night of the ambush, had all passed through one single hand, the hand of the man he had trusted most for more than 10 years. Ryder summoned a few of his most loyal men outside Silas's circle of control, and quietly checked every detail of the night he had been shot at the harbor. And piece by piece, the fragments came together into a complete portrait of betrayal, because it was Silas who had arranged the route that night. Silas who had chosen the isolated meeting place where he would be easy to ambush, and Silas who alone had known he would pass through that road at that exact hour. He remembered the moment in the study when Silas had reported on June, that glance that had flicked away so quickly, the one Ryder had noticed but ignored, that silence which had lasted longer than necessary before he answered. And now, looking back, he understood that those signs had never been accidental. He also remembered the news that Beckett had recently gone unusually quiet, and everything became clear with brutal precision, that Beckett's silence hadn't meant he was retreating, but that he already had an eye and a hand planted right beside Ryder, a perfect insider Ryder had nurtured and trusted with his own life. Ryder summoned Silas to meet him privately in the dark room, and when the man stepped inside with his usual composed face, still wearing the look of loyalty that had fooled him for all those years, Ryder didn't shout and didn't swing his fist. He only placed on the table the evidence he had gathered, piece by piece, and watched. Silas looked down at the things on the table, and for one very long moment, that calm mask did not collapse, but he did not bother denying it either, because both men in that room understood that the game was over. And then Silas lifted his head, a thin, cold smile passing over his lips, admitting the truth not with a confession, but with the very silence that refused to deny it. He said quietly that loyalty was a luxury only men without ambition could afford to keep, that he had stood in Ryder's shadow for too long, doing all the dirty work while never being allowed to sit in the chair at the top, and that when Beckett came to him with an offer, he had simply chosen what he deserved. Silas added coldly that the ambush that night should have ended Ryder cleanly, if not for a homeless girl cutting in and ruining everything, and because of her, every plan afterward had to change. Those words made Ryder understand that June had not once, but twice, stood between him and the death laid out by the very man he had trusted most. Ryder stood motionless, looking at the man who had once been his right hand, and inside him there was no longer a burst of rage, only a deadly coldness, because now he knew the entire web of betrayal closing around him, knew Beckett was behind it and Silas was planted inside it, and he understood that to avenge his mother and protect June, he would have to face both of them at once. But this time, he held the weapon they had never expected, the very evidence his mother had traded her life to keep safe. Ryder didn't act rashly like a betrayed man desperate for immediate revenge, because he understood that in his world, one poorly calculated strike would only get him killed, and instead he spent many days preparing in silence, letting Silas believe he still hadn't been fully exposed, while quietly gathering the men who remained loyal and rearranging every piece on the board. He knew that power in the Hollister family did not rest in his hands alone, but was divided among a council of the heads of the different branches, old and suspicious men who ran the underground empire according to unwritten rules that had existed for generations, and that to bring Beckett and Silas down decisively, he couldn't simply kill them in the dark. He had to expose their crimes before that very council, so the sentence would be handed down according to the laws of the world they all obeyed. Ryder called a closed meeting of the council at an old warehouse by the harbor, a neutral place where, by tradition, no one was allowed to carry weapons or provoke violence. And when all the heads had gathered around the long table under the dim lights, he walked in with Beckett and Silas, both of whom still believed this was an ordinary meeting about dividing territory again. He began not with accusations, but by quietly placing on the table the pages his mother had collected, meticulous evidence of the operations Beckett had been secretly carrying out behind the council's back, the money he had embezzled, the agreements he had signed in secret with rival gangs to strengthen his own power. All of it laying bare a man who had betrayed not only Ryder but also the most sacred principles of the family. The entire council sank into a heavy silence as each sheet of paper was passed from hand to hand, and Beckett's face slowly turned pale as he realized the trap was closing around him. He tried to deny it loudly, tried to accuse Ryder of fabricating the evidence, but the numbers and the names on those pages were too detailed and matched too closely with the things the council members themselves had quietly suspected for a long time to be dismissed as false. Then Ryder turned to Silas, and in a voice calm enough to be terrifying, he laid out proof of the collusion between his own right-hand man and Beckett, proof of the staged ambush, proof of the fire set at the house to eliminate an innocent witness. And this time, even Silas's seasoned composure couldn't save him, because in the underworld there was no crime heavier than a trusted man selling out his own master. Ryder did not pretend to be noble or merciful in that moment. His eyes were still cold and sharp as knives. His voice still carried the full cruelty that had made his name, because he was not standing there as a man completely redeemed, but still as a boss reclaiming what belonged to him and avenging the dead. And it was that familiar coldness that made the council trust him and side with him. When the silent votes were exchanged through quiet nods around the table, the balance of power had tilted completely toward Ryder. Beckett and Silas were stripped of every position on the spot, abandoned with cold indifference by the very men who had been their allies only moments before, and their fate was decided according to the same brutal law they had once used to climb upward. Ryder rose in the room that was now entirely under his control, watched as the two traitors were escorted away into the darkness, and knew that he had just taken back not only the seat of power, but also the chance to complete the very thing his mother had sacrificed everything to pursue. Even though the full price for all of this had still not yet been paid, Beckett and Silas vanished from Providence in the way traitors in the underworld always vanished, quietly and without a trace, judged by the harsh laws both of them had once served. And Ryder didn't need to say clearly what had happened to them, because the silence that settled over their names said everything. A purge carried out beyond the reach of the law, and inside the darkness where the Hollister family enforced its own justice. But when the final revenge had cooled, and the man who had ordered his mother killed had paid the price, Ryder didn't feel victory the way he had once imagined throughout all those years of hatred. He felt only a vast emptiness, because punishing the guilty couldn't bring his mother back, couldn't return the 25 stolen years, couldn't erase the curses he had poured onto her name while she had loved him from the dark. Standing at the height of power he had just reclaimed through blood and strategy, Ryder realized that this underground empire was the very thing that had killed his mother, the very swamp she had sacrificed everything to pull him out of, and that if he continued sitting in that chair, he would forever betray the last thing she had prayed for, that he would live, and live well. And so the man who had once built his entire life on violence and power began doing something no one in his world had ever dared to imagine. He quietly dismantled the empire from within, transferring the parts that could be transferred, closing the darkest lines, withdrawing from the shadows step by careful step with the caution of a man who knew that letting go of power was no less dangerous than seizing it. He used the immense fortune accumulated over all those years, the blood-stained money he now wanted to cleanse in another sense, to establish a housing foundation for the homeless people of Providence, a place to shelter those cast aside by society the way June had once been cast aside. And he named it the Margot House, so that the name he had hated his whole life would now be carved onto a place of kindness and protection. June, after recovering from the wounds of the night of the fire, was the person he trusted to run that foundation, because no one understood better than she did what it felt like to sleep curled up in the cold with no roof overhead, and no one knew how to give sincere kindness better than the woman who had once cleaned a house that wasn't hers with all the gratitude in her heart. And June accepted that responsibility with her whole heart. She used the nursing knowledge she had never finished pursuing to care for the struggling people who came to the Margot House, learning each person's name, listening to each story, treating every torn life with a respect they themselves had forgotten they deserved to receive. The house bearing his late mother's name slowly became a place where people the world had once stepped over without even looking were seen as real human beings, and every time Ryder visited and saw June among the people she was helping, he felt something inside him heal a little more, because he understood that this was the true legacy his mother had wanted to leave behind. Not revenge, not power, but the transformation of his own heart that had once been frozen solid, and that the silent love of a mother, after 25 years buried behind a wall, had finally blossomed into compassion for strangers. On the very ground where the old house had burned to ashes, Ryder had a new house built, not a lavish mansion, but a warm home exactly like the one where his mother had once lived. Every line, every window, every corner of the porch rebuilt from the old photographs in the tin box, as though he were trying to mend not only a roof over his head, but also a past that had been burned away by hatred and lies. When the house was finished, Ryder invited June there on an afternoon when golden sunlight stretched across the brick-paved street of Federal Hill, and they stood together before the new wooden door, two people who had passed through fire, bullets, and loss to find each other. And then Ryder reached into his coat pocket and took out a set of keys, this time not with the contemptuous gesture of a man throwing away trash as he had on that fateful night long ago, but with trembling hands and eyes bright with tears. He placed the keys in June's palm with reverence, closed her fingers around them, and in a voice thick with emotion, he said that this house was hers. Not as a debt being repaid, not as charity, but as everything that remained of his heart, and that he hoped she would stay here, stay beside him, so they could turn this place into a true home together. June looked at the keys in her hand, then lifted her eyes to the face of the man who had once been cold and ruthless, and was now standing before her bare and wounded like an ordinary human being, and tears rolled down her cheeks, because she understood that this moment was the perfect opposite of the night when she had trembled while receiving the keys from a man who had treated her like garbage. And this time, what was being given was not contempt, but love. They both cried, not from pain, but from a deep relief, because two broken souls had finally found a place where they could heal, and they held each other before the threshold of the house that carried the spirit of the mother who had sacrificed everything, the mother he no longer hated, but only loved and thanked beyond measure. People would later still tell the story of the most ruthless boss on the Providence waterfront, the man who had once thrown a set of keys into the hand of a homeless girl as though throwing away a piece of trash, but no one knew that those very keys had opened the final and darkest room in his heart, the room where, for 25 years, a mother had quietly waited for her son to come home. And this story, ladies and gentlemen, leaves all of us with a profound lesson, that we should never judge the value of a human being by outward appearance or by their circumstances, because the person society is quick to cast aside sometimes carries the noblest heart, and that sincere kindness, no matter how small, still has the power to reach and transform even hearts that seem to have frozen forever. Just as it reminds us that sometimes the things we are certain are true about the people we love may only be painful misunderstandings. So let's love and understand one another while we still can, and don't let hatred steal the precious years we were meant to spend together. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can listen to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. And we would truly love to know how this story made you feel, what it reminded you of in your own life, whether you have ever met someone who was misjudged or experienced some misunderstanding with a loved one. So please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always cherish the chance to listen to every story and every feeling you carry. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment, and we sincerely wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, peace, serenity, and love-filled days. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.